Welcome to the Jesus Movement. It's a pleasure to be here again. It's Wednesday night here, and we're broadcasting our Journey to Faith series. Tonight we've moved along in the genealogy of Jesus as we're teaching each week, and we've arrived at the time of King Solomon. So it's a very exciting chapter of the Bible. There's a lot happens with King Solomon. We see very great things of great grandeur and splendour, and then we see things which are quite an abomination, which will lead to the separation of Israel into a southern and northern kingdom. So we're going to get underway. So the lesson tonight is called Solomon Ascends the Throne, with this beautiful illustration. It's a little bit later in the story of King Solomon next to the sea and the Temple of Jerusalem with all of the priests behind him there. So Solomon's story, as I said, is a wonderful story, and very excited to be able to bring it to you. Last week we basically finished up with the context of King David handing the reins over to King Solomon, but we find that everything that needed to be done is actually not complete at this stage, because Solomon was tasked by his father David to actually do some things which he left unfinished. So we're going to have a look at that tonight as well. So just to talk about the genealogy, first of all, we find here in the genealogy of Jesus, which you'll find in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, that it says David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So we find another reference here to a female in the genealogy of Jesus, one of three, and they're not a common thing. So females are normally not included in the ancient genealogy, and they're also only in there for a particular purpose. So we see in this one, it's almost like the sin of King David has actually been carried through into the genealogy for all time, because he says here, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So of course we know that King David sinned, and he had Uriah killed, Uriah the Hittite, and he'd slept with Bathsheba, whose name is not mentioned, but he's called Uriah's wife because it's named after the male. So quite an extraordinary statement that's actually placed there. And then just to give the background for this, before I go on, we just mentioned that we broadcast live on Facebook, but all of the recordings are placed onto YouTube and onto our website. So if you type in Paul Brunton, the Jesus Movement, or the jesusmovement.com.au, you can watch the videos back. You can spend some time to absorb all of the information, or if you actually missed the lesson live, you can have the opportunity to watch it again, so you can avail yourself of that. Okay, so kicking off with Solomon. Solomon had another name. Does anyone remember his name? He was given another name before he was called Solomon. It's mentioned in the Bible. I did mention it when he was born earlier on, that if your memory fails you, he was actually called Jedediah, which is spelled Jedidih. So when he was born, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 24 to 25, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background because we're starting a new descendant in the genealogy of Jesus. So 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 24 to 25, it says, the Lord loved him, and because the Lord loved him, he sent words through Nathan the prophet to name him Jedediah. And so this name was given to him by the Lord. Found in the first book of Kings and both books of Chronicles in the Bible, King David's son Solomon is anointed as the third king of the United Kingdom of Israel, because of course King Saul was anointed as the first. He was born about 1011 BC and dies in 931 BC. We're going to talk a little bit about dating more as we go, because we come along in a situation where the there's an ability to date accurately this time of the Bible, because there's a historical event that occurs which is aligned specifically with a specific king and event. And in these books, the Bible says that the kings were born, they lived for so long, they ruled for so long, and so it's able to evaluate the date. So rather than using estimates, we can actually use accurate dates. So 1011 BC he was born, and he died in 931 BC. Now, the usual dates for Solomon's reign are 970 to 931 BC. And so there's people who have done estimates in the past, but as I said, we can be fairly accurate now. So he's the last king of the United Kingdom of Israel. So David united the king, his father, the kingdom, and Solomon's going to be the last and only one who actually gets to enjoy the full kingdom as a unified nation. The 10 northern tribes are going to break away from the kingdom of Israel a bit later, and the 2 remaining tribes will form the southern kingdom of Judah and be ruled by his son Rehoboam. And the consequence of this is actually as a result of the actions of what King Solomon does during his lifetime. So God's plan for David, Solomon's father, was to unite his people as one royal nation dwelling in the land of milk and honey. And so God's plan for David was to actually unite the nation specifically. He was the man who went before Solomon, who fought against all of the enemies of Israel to overcome them and to unite them. Like his forefather Abraham, who God brought to this land almost 1,000 years earlier, David was promised many descendants from whom one would come to fulfill God's plan to reconcile people back into relationship with him, since sin had caused them to be separated since the dawn of time. So this echoes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, what's happening now. God's plan for Solomon was given to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 to 16. And he said to him, "When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish the kingdom, his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of the kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son." And so we see through this that Solomon has a very special place in the Lord's heart. He had his own name for him, and he says that he will be as his son. So he has a very special plan for Solomon. David then charged his son Solomon to build a house for the Lord as a consequence of the Lord telling him that it was his son to build. And it was a place that would become known as the Temple of Jerusalem as we still know it today. So we read from 1 Chronicles chapter 22 verse 7 to 10. So again, 1 Chronicles chapter 22 verse 7 to 10. It says, "My son, I had it in my heart." So this is King David speaking to his son. The Lord spoke to King David and said, "Your son's to build it," and now David speaks to Solomon in turn. "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me, and it said, you have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him rest from all his enemies on every side. His name will be Solomon, and I will grant Israel peace and quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name." And so there's no question that King Solomon is meant to be king, and that he's the one who is to build the Temple of Jerusalem. It was spoken directly to David and then directly to Solomon. So after David declared his son Solomon to be the next king, he was anointed twice before the Lord and before the people of Israel. And so we have this scripture from the Bible, and this wonderful picture for you. Now this picture is actually in the art gallery in New South Wales here in Australia. And the scripture from 1 Chronicles chapter 22 verse 7 to 10 says, the Lord highly exalted Solomon in the sight of all Israel and bestowed on him royal splendour such as no king over Israel ever had before. And so we see him here. This is he in his palace. There's many descriptions that are known, both biblically and otherwise, about the palace. And so this artist has rebuilt the temple. This is only a portion of the total image, which I'll show later. And it's actually an image from when the Queen of Sheba came to visit him. And so the purpose of showing this, of course, is all of the splendour that you can see here. You may remember last week I talked about the amount of gold and silver in the incredible volume that it was. And so we can see all the way through here that all these things are actually gold, they're real gold. And so it must have been incredible to be in the presence there. So the Bible tells us that the Lord highly exalted him, and as I said, it was the splendour that he had was bestowed on him by the Lord. And so this sets the tone for King Solomon's early journey in life. And I showed some maps last week about where King David's palace was and where King Solomon's palace was going to be built closer to the threshing floor of Araunah, which is the temple mount today. And so King Solomon actually builds a new palace as well. And the new palace and the temple mount and the new grounds are actually larger than the whole city of David. Okay? So all of this wealth that was coming in and these cedar logs that were coming down from the king of Tyre, they weren't just for the temple, they were actually also for the palace. And so Solomon builds a bigger and much grander palace than his father had as well. And so we see this declaration from the Lord. So Solomon became the wealthiest king on earth, the Bible tells us at this time. Promised a time of peace, God charged him to build his house. So tonight we're going to start the journey with King Solomon and see what that actually looks like. Now, I mentioned earlier that when he established the throne, there were some issues with him establishing the throne. So when Solomon firmly established the throne of his father as his own, no sooner had his father David passed away when his older half-brother Adoniah sprang up again and went to his mother Bathsheba. So he was the son who was the eldest at the time, and so he thought it was his right to inherit the throne of Israel. He'd already challenged him and had himself crowned without the authorization of his father or the anointing of the Lord. In the previous week we covered that. And so here he's not done yet, so he springs up again. So knowing he was next in line to the throne by order of birth, Adoniah sought Abishag the Shunammite's hand in marriage. Does anyone remember who Abishag was? We mentioned her last week as well. So she was wasn't she the young girl to keep David warm while he slept? Right, so Abishag was his bed warmer. Sounds terrible, doesn't it? His water bottle. His water bottle. There was no intimate relationship, but she was there to keep him warm and to meet all of his needs as an elderly and dying man. So as a consequence, Adoniah thought, well, she's fair game, because if she was actually recognised to be beside King David, then if I married her, then that would give me some authority and recognition in the nation of Israel, right? But obviously he's not right. So he still sought to challenge Solomon for the throne. And in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 15 to 16, and we're mainly going to be in 1 Kings tonight. So 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 15 to 16, he said, "As you know, the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as their king. But things changed, and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. Now I have one request to make of you. Do not refuse me." So this is Adoniah speaking to Bathsheba. So he's actually saying, as you know, everybody recognised me. Well, that obviously wasn't the case. But this is how he's pleading to Bathsheba to manipulate an outcome. So Adoniah asked Bathsheba to ask her son Solomon for Abishag to be given to him as his wife. Agreeing to do so, Bathsheba went to Solomon to speak to him for Adoniah. So we see one of these human character traits happening, isn't it? We don't go directly to the person that we need something from. We go around the back door to try and manipulate an outcome, because we actually know in our heart that it's not righteous and it shouldn't be happening, but we go about doing it anyway. So King Solomon was sitting on his throne, holding court in the palace, when he noticed his mother Bathsheba enter the hall. He loved his mother deeply, and as she approached, he stood up and bowed down to her in greeting. Signaling to the servants in attendance, he had them bring another throne for her and place it next to his on the right-hand side. So you can see from this picture behind me, you can get a picture of what this looks like. So here's his throne up here. This is his throne up here. There's another seat beside it. So he's saying, come and sit here. So it wouldn't have been empty. There would have been all of the people in attendance in the palace. After she sat down and made herself comfortable, she turned to her son and asked him not to refuse a small request she wanted to ask for him. Assuring her that he would not deny her request, she said in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 21, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given in marriage to your brother Adoniah." So you can see here as well, not only is Adoniah going around the back door, but she approaches her son in a public space, okay, where there would be lots of noise in the court. So King Solomon was taken aback, and he answered his mother in verse 22 of 1 Kings chapter 2, "Why do you request Abishag the Shunammite for Adoniah? You might as well request the kingdom for him. After all, he is my elder brother. Yes, for him and for Abiathar the priest and Joab, son of Zeruiah." So he recognises that those are the three that came together to declare that they were going to rule the kingdom before Solomon went and declared it under the anointing of his father. And so when Solomon speaks to his mother here, he not only names the one man, Adoniah, his half-brother, but he actually names the priest and the commander at the same time. So he's obviously got a bone to pick with all of them. They're all in this together. So Solomon knew this was much more than a marriage proposal. It was a second attempt to take the throne. And you might ask, well, how can this be? When his older brother, Absalom, so he was the son that challenged King David himself, okay? So this is the second one. Adoniah's the next brother again after that. So when his older brother Absalom rebelled against his father, he publicly raped David's concubines to demonstrate he possessed the royal harem. Do you remember that story? Okay, so in the society of the time, this was akin to claiming the throne, for possessing a king's woman meant that you were in the head of the house. Although Abishag shared no intimacy with David when she shared his bed, this was not common knowledge and the principle still applied. And so Adoniah knew this. He knew that if he was to marry this woman, it would give him a claim upon the throne. So King Solomon swore an oath before the Lord that Adoniah would pay with his life for such a request and welcome God's punishment should he be wrong. He called Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who still commanded the Kerethites and the Pelethites, loyal to his father. So they're the personal guards of King David from those clans, and the throne that he had established, and gave him orders to put Adoniah to death. Benaiah had Adoniah brought to him and personally struck him down dead, and thus the legacy of God's punishment continued. Yet another of David's sons had been put to death. Remember the curse that he had for sleeping with Bathsheba. And so we see yet another son now killed. Now this had erupted whilst holding court with his mother beside him. King Solomon suddenly addressed Abiathar the priest, who had supported Adoniah against the Lord's appointment of his kingship. And in verse 26 of 1 Kings chapter 2, he says, "Go back to your fields in Anathoth. You deserve to die, but I will not put you to death now, because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord before my father David and shared all of my father's hardships." So I have a couple of images here. First of all, I've just put up this from the previous lesson because it shows the family tree going from David down to Solomon, and then Solomon had the elder brother we just mentioned, Absalom, who challenged David, and then Adoniah, who's now challenging him. And so this is just to give us some clarity. So all the way through here we see that David was actually challenged by Saul's son, David was challenged by his eldest son, and now the son that he anointed is now being challenged by the next oldest son. So it's a pretty tumultuous history that's happening so far. And I'll just put this map up here so you can see this. So he just mentioned about this travelling, where they're actually to travel to. So I'll leave this up as we talk through this scripture, because it pertains to some of the events that are on this map. So I will point them out, and you'll see the relevance of what I'm saying as I'm going. Okay, so Solomon removed Abiathar from the priesthood in which he had served his whole life. He was told to go back to his fields in Anathoth that were 5 kilometres north of Jerusalem. This fulfilled the word of the Lord he had spoken at Shiloh about the house of Eli. And that scripture was from 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 31 to 32. So 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 31 to 32, and it reads, "The time is coming when I'll cut short your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your family line, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, in your family line there will never be an old man." And so this priest is a descendant of his, and now he too is no longer as a result. So all of these prophetic words or curses that happened prior to this time are all being fulfilled in the beginning of King Solomon's reign. And this happened because the sons of Eli the priest were wicked and didn't honour the Lord. So you might remember that they didn't continue on with the priesthood, and this is when the time changed, isn't it? They asked for a king, and this is the precursor to that. And because Eli knew what they did but did not stop them, the Lord promised that all of Eli's descendants would die in the prime of their lives. So Solomon decided to give Abiathar a reprieve from physical death, but he was removed from the priesthood and suffered a spiritual death separated from God. And so that was the state of play for him. Now Solomon's cousin Joab, who still commanded Israel's army, received news of Adoniah's death and Abiathar's removal from the priesthood. Complicit in Adoniah's attempt to seize the throne, he fled northwest to the tent of meeting in the priest city of Gibeon, which was 9 kilometres away, and took hold of the horns of the altar like Adoniah did before him when he tried to usurp Solomon's right to the throne. In the same way Adoniah had received mercy, Joab clung to the horns of the altar, hoping for the same. So this is here on that map. So both of these locations we've spoken from are just north of Jerusalem, but here's Gibeon, so he's gone to where the altar is. So at this point in time, the Temple of Jerusalem is not built. And so the Ark of the Covenant resides in David's city in a tent. The altar and the high place for the priesthood is still there residing in Gibeon. So he's gone back up here, and he's decided that he too is going to hang on to the horned altar. And so we move to this location of Gibeon. So a messenger brought news that Joab son of Zeruiah, King Solomon's cousin, had fled to the altar at the tent of meeting. Once again the king called upon Benaiah son of Jehoiada, and coming forward King Solomon ordered him to strike Joab down. Joab was beside the altar of the Lord when he heard someone noisily and rapidly approaching from outside the tent of meeting. So again, the tent of meeting is here at this point in time. He quickly gripped one of the horns of the altar as Benaiah entered the tent, and Benaiah abruptly came to halt, and he said in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 30, the king says, "Come out." So not very exciting speech, is it? But come out in the name of the king. But he refused. Joab said he would rather die there. So Benaiah was unsure what to do. He had travelled all this way, but wouldn't it be sacrilegious to execute Joab on the Lord's altar? He decided to leave the tent of meeting from the high place in Gibeon and travelled all the way back to Solomon in Jerusalem to report what Joab had said. So he went there and said, "The king says come out," and Joab said, "No, go away." And so he goes away. So King Solomon was still seated with his mother next to him when Benaiah son of Jehoiada returned. Benaiah was covered in dust and perspiring because he'd just run all the way back, and he entered the great hall of the palace. The king couldn't help but notice how troubled he was, and he listened as he described what happened and aired his concerns about striking Joab at the altar of the Lord. So King Solomon commanded him in verse 31 of 1 Kings chapter 2, "Do as he says, strike him down and bury him, and so clear me and my father's house of the guilt of the innocent blood that Joab shed." So all of the things that happened in the past are all being paid for. You might remember that Joab ran away earlier in the piece with King David, right? Because he actually killed King David's son Absalom.
But King David also told Solomon, as on his dying bed, as he was dying his wish, and he says to him, "Do not let his grey hair go down in peace."
Right.
Yeah. So
Exactly, and we're just about to come to that. So you're absolutely spot on. So well done. No, it's great. So the thing is that we find the beginning of Solomon's journey. It's not all about splendour. It's about him tidying up all of these past loose ends, if you want to call it, or curses as they seem, or basically people who behaved badly and had committed murders against the wishes of the king. And so we find Solomon's now going to sort it all out. Of course he needs to, because his own kingdom is under threat, his own rule, by these very same people. So moving on, so Benaiah retraced his steps back to Gibeon. He entered the tent of the Lord and struck Joab down. He then instructed the men to take Joab's body to be buried on his own land in the desert. We find that in verse 34 of 1 Kings chapter 2. Now Joab had been with David for many years, but when he was executed by Solomon's order, he was buried on his own land, and it says in the desert. I was intrigued by this, and when I tried to find the location, it's actually not mentioned by name. So where did Joab, the son of Zeruiah, come from? I could ask that question, but it'd probably take you a long time to evaluate, so I will answer, of course. So when we cast back to the time of David's father Jesse, we learned that he was not the father of David's half-sisters Abigail and Zeruiah. Their father was in fact the Ammonite king who was called Nahash. In 2 Samuel chapter 17 verse 25, it reads, "Amasa was the son of a man named Jephthah, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab." And so the Bible has all this information, but it's all tucked away in different parts of the story. But if you actually pull them together, you realise, you can be a bit of a detective and work out where places and people come from. So David's half-sisters were conceived through his mother's previous marriage to Nahash. So this may give insight into why Nahash was actually kind to David. Remember, David went to him, the Ammonite king, and he asked him for protection. And he did, he protected him. And so now we find out, well, this is why, because of the sisters. So perhaps out of respect for his mother, who was his former wife, in 2 Samuel chapter 10, verses 1 to 2, it reads, "In the course of time, the king of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun succeeded him as king. David thought, I will show kindness to Hanun, son of Nahash, just as his father showed kindness to me." So you see there's this relationship that they had during this period of time in David's journey. When David had to go on the run from his son Absalom, this is where he ended up. And so we find this kindness being exchanged. And so obviously Solomon knows about this. This has been passed on. So from examining the genealogy of David's mother, we can discover that Joab was the grandson of the Ammonite king Nahash, and thus when his body was being taken to his own land in the desert, Benaiah had instructed his men to take Joab's body to a place called Rabbah Ammon, which is the Ammonite capital, on the plateau east of the Jordan River. Ironically, this is the very place that Joab besieged and defeated when David sent Uriah the Hittite to his death after he slept with Solomon's mother Bathsheba. And so it comes full circle. The place where Joab's going is where he actually had Uriah executed. And so on this map, this is where this arrow points to that I was mentioning earlier. So they went from here, from Gibeon, where he was pulled off the altar and struck down, and then they took him back to Rabath Ammon. So this is on the edge of the Syro-Arabian desert. It's desert up there. And so the description of the desert is fulfilled by the location, which comes out of the relationship history between David and the sisters of the king who gave him help when he was in his moment of need. And that time, of course, was when he was running away from his son Absalom, who had put a claim on the throne. And so we find this whole thing comes full circle, and Joab ends up back in the same place. And so it allows us to understand what that place was. So it's essential to know that every circumstance in the Bible is subject to God's plans, purposes, and laws. Job's death is no exception. And I'm going to come to what was mentioned a moment earlier. When David charged Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 5 to 6, "Do not let his grey head go down to the grave in peace," and Solomon charged Benaiah son of Jehoiada to strike him down, they sought to fulfill one of God's laws given to Moses at Mount Sinai. The law states in Exodus chapter 21 verse 14, "But if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death." And so we find all of these actions that are taken are actually fulfilling what God calls them to do at all times. And so the Bible is a fascinating book in that sense of the word, because every action that happens is according to God's plan and God's will and fulfillment of God's laws. And we see this happening right here now. And so this concludes, obviously, a quite a large chapter of the story of the Bible, because these people have been associated with King David and now with King Solomon. Now, years earlier, when David made Edom subject to Israel, the young prince Hadad was successfully smuggled out and taken to Egypt, where the Pharaoh granted him asylum. As he grew up, the Pharaoh was so pleased with him that he gave his wife's sister to him in marriage. And we read about this in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 19. When the news of the death of David and its commander Joab reached Egypt, having lived under the authority and protection of the Pharaoh, Hadad sought permission to return to his own country. The Pharaoh wasn't pleased after all he had done for him, and he asked in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 22, "What have you lacked here that you want to go back to your own country?" "Nothing," Hadad replied, "but do let me go." So what's going to start happening now, where we're going, is Egypt starts to play a big role in the biblical story, more and more so. And so we're going to start connecting the dots. The first wife of King Solomon, are you all aware that she was actually from Egypt? Right? She was actually a Pharaoh's daughter. So we're going to head there in a moment and explain this. So finishing with Joab and Abiathar, King Solomon called Benaiah son of Jehoiada and Zadok the priest. They had demonstrated their loyalty to his father and now to him. So King Solomon made Benaiah the new commander over all of Israel's army, and Zadok replaced Abiathar in charge of the Ark of the Covenant. King David also asked Shimei son of Gera to be brought to account for cursing him bitterly when he fled his other son Absalom. So we spoke about this before as well. When King David was actually going up to this location we just showed on the map, this man was cursing him and throwing stones at him. And so when David died on his deathbed, he said to his son, "Don't forget this guy." And so here he is now coming back to this. So King David, he said, "Bring his grey head down to the grave in blood," in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 9. And so you notice this is the second time he talks about grey hair, grey beard. So obviously these people are getting older, and so he's defining that they've been around for a while. So King Solomon sent for him, and when he arrived, he said in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 36 to 37, "Build yourself a house in Jerusalem and live there, but do not go anywhere else. The day you leave and cross the Kidron Valley, you can be sure you will die. Your blood will be on your own head." Shimei had no choice but to agree. So Shimei did build his house in Jerusalem, and he obeyed King Solomon for 3 years, until one day 2 of his slaves ran off to the king of Gath, Achish, son of Maachah. Shimei was furious. So what did he do? He disobeyed. He saddled his donkey and he went to Gath to look for them. As soon as they were found, he returned back to Jerusalem with them. But word had got out. Solomon was told he had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and back again. So King Solomon summons him when he arrives back. And even though he had returned, Shimei had failed to keep his oath that he made before the Lord. So remember, Shimei had actually said, if I leave, then I will set the consequences. And asked why he disobeyed, King Solomon reminded Shimei of the consequences for his actions. So in 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 44, he says, you know in your heart all the wrong you did to my father David. Now the Lord will repay you for your wrongdoing. King Solomon called his newly appointed commander, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, who came and bowed before him. Commanded to strike Shimei down, Benaiah bowed again and turned on his heel. But he had Shimei dragged outside and struck him down dead. All those who had cursed or threatened his father or himself were now dead. The transition from the reign of King David was complete. And so in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 46, it says simply the kingdom was now firmly established in Solomon's hands. And so tidying up all of these past problems from people who had come against his father or himself has basically been his first priority of business as the new king of Israel. He had to remove any threat and any enemy to his reign. And so this is the point in time that we come up to. Okay, so although the kingdom of Israel was granted peace by God, because that's what God said, during the reign of Solomon, this did not mean that the Israelites had displaced all previous nations from the promised land. Do you know who's still left? What race of people is there still some resistance from? They've been knocked on the head a couple of times, but they're still actually, the Philistines, they're actually still going. So we just read that when Shimei son of Gera went to Philistine Gath, that it was still ruled by their own king, who was called Achish son of Maachah. The Philistines were originally, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background. This is one of those common questions, especially with modern politics, about Palestine and the Philistines. And so the Philistines were originally descendants of Mizraim, Mizraim, and Mizraim is Noah's grandson by Ham. Remember, Noah had 3 of his sons. Now this can be found in Genesis chapter 10, verses 13 to 14. So it's a genealogical statement. Some spread westwards, the Bible tells us, to Crete and the other islands in the Aegean Sea. So they give a location for where they actually go to. In Jeremiah, there's a reference from chapter 47, verse 4, that says from the coasts of Caphtor. Okay, there's been a lot of discussion about where exactly is Caphtor, but it's believed to either be the Isle of Crete, one of the Aegean islands, or Cyprus. It's in the west, it's in the actual ocean itself. And so they know that these people have come from that region. Now, I'm going to go into a bit of the Egyptian history because it starts to align with what the Bible's talking about and reveals to us who they actually are. Some of them inhabited the tract of land that formed the southwestern coastal trade corridor that passed between Egypt and Canaan. So we're talking about the Philistines. In Genesis chapter 20, verses 1 to 2, chapter 21, verses 32 to 34, it says that there was Philistines that were already living there. That's where they came from. So we're now sort of going, well, where did they actually come from in turn? So those from the islands, they were actually known as sea peoples. And those in the southwest corner of Canaan, they were known as the Pulsata or the Pulista on Egyptian monuments. So these same people that we call the Philistines in the Bible, the Egyptians have historical documentation. In fact, their temples are carved with this information, and they call them pulsata, Pulsata, or pulista, Pulista. You can see the pulista and the Philistine. You can see the Philistia and the Pulistia. You can see the alignment between two different languages there. So they're recorded on Egyptian monuments, and it says that they were subject to Egyptian rule and forced to pay taxes until anarchy weakened and ended the 19th dynasty of pharaohs between 1378 and 1323 BC. So I've done a bit of delving into history to align what's going on in the Bible at this time and what's going on in history at the same time to pull all this together. So Egypt's power was diminished at this time, but they weren't on their own, because in the whole region of the Middle East it had become unstable at this period of time in history. Treaties between old empires came to an end, self-satisfied rulers became weak, which means they didn't actually have their armies strong, they didn't go out, they actually just stayed within, and they took care of themselves and had a good time, but they became weak by doing so. And there was also an issue with the scarcity of harvest failing due to drought. So we parted, when we were teaching on this, from Egyptian chronology earlier, when the first 19th dynasty pharaoh, so hear this because we're talking about the same dynasty, it was actually Ramses I that I said was the pharaoh who was drowned in 1491 BC when he was chasing the Israelites across the parted waters. Okay, so this is that same period of time. By the time Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjamite, led the nation of Israel as a judge, so I'm skipping through the different events. The first 20th dynasty pharaoh was called Sennacherib. He came to power in 1322 BC, so we have these shifts of these pharaohs. Pharaoh Sennacherib had to work hard to bring his country back into unity, but after a short reign of only 4 years, he died in 1318 BC. So when we look at Egyptian history, we find that many pharaohs don't live very long, they change over very, very quickly. And so it was during this time. Succeeded by his son Pharaoh Ramses III, his work was further consolidated until Egypt came under attack from Libya in the 5th year of his son's reign. The efforts of father and son were rewarded though when Libya was easily repelled. So we all know where Libya is. I think it's on the next. No, I'm going to flip back and forth. So Libya, so here's the top of Egypt and the Nile Delta. Libya is just here. Libya is the next country along on the coast to the west of Egypt. And so they shared a border, and so the Libyans would come and they would raid into Egypt as well. And so when Egypt became weak, they became an increasing threat on their border. So we've got what's going on biblically here in Israel on one side, and then we've got these other countries both to the west of Egypt, and also from Sudan and Ethiopia, they would come up and they would raid into Egypt as well. So you may look at it as a big desert, but there's lots of people who were very happy to raid and get the wealth and the riches that came out of Egypt. So history tells us there was a Libyan attack and it was repelled, but just 3 years later, a much greater threat presented itself when a huge number of sea peoples came together to attack them. Some marched south by land whilst a large sailing fleet supported them from the sea. So the sea peoples came from, so this is the Mediterranean here. So we're mentioning Crete, and Cyprus, Aegean Sea. So these people would come down and they would come by boat. But they would also send a land force around the border as well. Apparently with the different armies in the ancient days, some of them had strong navies, weak armies, some had strong armies and weak navies. And so the Greek, because they were a seafaring nation, their land soldiers were not very good. Whereas their navy, they were very, very powerful. And so when they sent foot soldiers down here, when they got down to here, into Philistia, the Egyptians were controlling the Philistines. And so they actually wiped them out before they got down to Egypt itself. And so they were coming in these two different directions. So they didn't make it. Now the sea peoples, as I said, was inexperienced on land and easily defeated, but their sailing fleet continued to sail south to the eastern side of the Nile Delta. Okay, so here's the Nile Delta. Back when we were talking about the time of exiting Egypt, we spoke about the Egyptian canals. There was one that was north-south and there was one that was east and west. And so this is the part where they were hemmed in and they had to cross the Reed Sea or the Red Sea. But in those days, this part of the Mediterranean was actually all underwater. And so there was access of very shallow land underneath the water in some of these areas. So when people came to attack or get access, it was actually easier to get close to the shore.
Wow, that's sorry, just a silly thing, but that is amazing. I just read that in Wilbur Smith book, in the last book.
Then it must be true.
Well, or exactly what you're saying. Someone that was very strong in the sea, so he was joining with them to be able to attack the north. While they were strong in the land. I mean, it was yeah.
So it's quite fascinating, but this is the background to one of the big questions that the world talks about today with the Palestinians. So the Egyptians were poor seamen, but they entered the conflict and fought with determination. So the Egyptians, they had the Nile, they had the deltas, but this was actually, these used to silt up all the time. So they didn't have a big seafaring fleet, they actually were strong on the land itself. And so we find here, when they came down with the vessels, the Egyptians went out to fight them. Now, the history tells us that they went out onto the Great Sea, which is now known as the Mediterranean Sea, supported by archers who Ramses III had lined along the shores. Their volleys of arrows were shot at the enemy ships if they approached the shore, whilst those on board the Egyptian ships used grappling hooks to pull the enemy ships into the sea people who weren't slain in the battle. So you can imagine these boats coming in, and the Egyptians in their small boats and on the shore attacking them very close to the shore. And it says they used these grappling hooks. And so they entered into hand-to-hand combat. The Egyptians in this battle were actually victorious, and the sea people who weren't slain in battle, who are known as the Philistines, the remnant, from Jeremiah chapter 47 verse 4, were taken to the southern coastal plain and put with the other Philistines next to the tribe of Judah. So what we find in history is they came down and attacked, they overcome them, and then they took them up to here underneath their rule again, because that's where they put them in the past. And so they didn't know them to come in their own country, they moved them up over here. Now, a previous picture which I skimmed over, this picture that's here, I'll just read it. It says, "This Egyptian relief, inscribed on the walls of the Medinet Habu temple of Ramses III, so this is the alignment with history and the dating, in Egypt has been reproduced and a plaque displayed at the ancient Philistine city of Gath in Israel." So when I was there with Roger, this plaque, I've actually enhanced it. It was actually very grey and I think it was yellow and purple in colour. So I stripped away the colour just to read the detail. And this is actually from the relief from the actual temple. So when you go to Gath in Israel, this is on top of the ancient tell. So this is a section which depicts them. And what happens here when you look at these, if you actually look at the way they're actually drawn with what's on their heads, all the different countries were represented with different types of headwear in those days. And this is one of the reasons why they talk about it being from these Cretan nations. So hand-to-hand combat between the sea peoples and the Egyptians on board their boats is illustrated in this relief. So they're showing them all grappled together, and they see the arrows sticking out of people's bodies everywhere, and so they're in hand-to-hand combat. So this is part of history. The Bible talks about it, but what the Bible says in Jeremiah when he spoke about them, he says the Philistines, the remnant, meaning that a lot of them were killed, but those who were left over were deposited back in the land again. So Ramses III, it says, easily overcame yet another conflict with the Libyans, but history tells us that when one of his minor wives led a conspiracy against him, that he was mortally wounded. So Ramses has got people coming at him everywhere. He's got them coming from the Mediterranean, he's got them coming from Libya on the other side, so obviously things aren't good. But when this Libyan attack happened again, he was mortally wounded and his reign ended, and Egypt returned to its economic problems. Disputes arose between governors and officials, and infighting between those who lived in the north and those who lived in the south continued to escalate until the last of the 20th dynasty Pharaoh, Ramses VI, died in 1199 BC. And so we see the end of their family altogether. With the end of the 20th dynasty Pharaohs came the relocation of the throne from the city of Ramses to a place called descendant, which I'll put this map back on. So here's Ramses. So this is the city of the Exodus, right? The Bible tells us that the Egyptian slaves, Ramses was one of the two cities that they actually built. So they relocated, and it's had its name changed through different empires ruling it. But all these ancient cities, they kept moving. Does anyone know why they kept changing the cities? There was actually an imperial reason, if you will, and there was actually a practical reason why they had to sometimes.
Is it a flood area? Or?
Right, so that's exactly right. So all of these different watercourses in the Nile Delta, they used to silt up from time to time. And so what would happen is they lost access to the actual city by water. And so they would up the city and build another one somewhere else where the water was flowing freely. And so two things would happen in time. Either a new pharaoh would come in, he'd build his new palace and claim his own authority in a different location, or they would move because the River Nile had actually silted up in one of the delta regions. And so this was the case that they actually moved this to this other location. So because of the change in Nile, it's the same. So the new 21st dynasty pharaohs no longer reigned in united Egypt because instability had caused the country to split into two. So this portion of history tells us that Egypt became divided. And so their power was limited to the delta region of Lower Egypt, while the high priest of Amun took the opportunity to rule Upper Egypt as kings from Thebes. So just in case you're not aware, Egypt, Lower Egypt, is actually this region here. It's called Lower, even though we look at a map and it looks like it's on top, it's called Lower because the river actually flows this way into the Mediterranean. It's actually lower in altitude. So Upper Egypt is actually in the desert heading southwards into Africa, and Lower Egypt is actually where it flows into the Nile Delta. So this region here was where most of the action happened with most dynasties, but there was some further up. And so we find at this point in time the two separate. So the priests take authority over the upper area, and the Libyans walked in and took authority over the Lower Delta. So it became split. So focus on the internal struggles. The presence of the Egyptians was not felt throughout the Middle East, and the Philistines, and this is the connection here, joined the Ammonites to raid and oppress the tribes of Israel in 1154. So the Bible tells us that the Philistines were constantly raiding the Israelites, and the Ammonites were on the other side. So we know the Ammonites were over here, and the Philistines are over here. So they were raiding from either side. Why were the Philistines, if they were enslaved people, free to raid? Because they were so busy in Egypt taking care of their own problems that the Philistines became their own authority. They were paying taxes to the Egyptians, history tells us that, right? But at this point in time there was no one saying do this and do that because they were in disarray in Egypt. So this ties into this period of time leading up to King David. Now the third pharaoh of the 21st dynasty was called Thusenes I, and he came to power in 1146. So sorry, I'm stepping through history here, but I just want you to get these main points. But it says that he had no control over them, for once again his people came under attack from the sea people. So we see that the Aegean region, they're becoming more and more powerful as we hear in history. Different empires come and go, and so these people are going out further and further afield to attack other countries. So Pharaoh Thusenes repelled the sea peoples to rule Egypt for 10 years before the Israelites were freed from Philistine and Ammonite oppression. So we're talking about the end of the period of Judges in the Bible. Whilst the effort required to repel the sea peoples severely depleted Egypt's resources, it caused them socio-economic problems and it spiraled into social unrest and political upheaval. So what happened at the same time was that God blessed the Israelites with abundance as righteous judges led his people in a way that pleased him. So we've got these two different histories going on next door to each other. Israelite prosperity continued until the leader, who was called Abdon, son of Hillel, passed away in 1110 BC. And in Judges 13:1 it says, "Again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years." So following these stepping stones of what's happening in Egypt, they fall into disarray during the period of time of Judges. The Philistines at the end grow powerful. They raid the Israelites, and we find here that when the last judge died, of course, what happened? They asked for a king. Okay? So this basically gives you a bit of a backdrop to what's happening next door. So, and this connects to Solomon, as you'll see in a moment. So Israelite prosperity, continued, as I said. So throughout the reign of this Pharaoh, the Philistines were free to act according to their will as he was entangled in his own domestic woes. And they raided and oppressed the Israelites until the end of the Pharaoh's reign, when he died in 1100 BC. Now Pharaoh Philistines was one of the last truly Egyptian pharaohs, for when the 22nd dynasty came in 1055 BC, so we're getting very close now to the beginning of the rule of King David. We're in the time of King Saul. The Egyptian people had succumbed to the attacks of the Libyans, their neighbours to the west, and come under their control. By the time King Saul was anointed king of Israel in 1051 BC, a new ruler from Libya, who was called Sheshonk the first, had become the first foreign pharaoh of a fractured Lower Egypt. So for the first time, the Egyptian people no longer believed their pharaohs were gods, because if they were, then they wouldn't have been defeated. Okay, so we have this is the end of the pharaohs, in the sense of them believing they were gods in history. And this connects to the Bible, which I'm going to explain. So although the Israelites rose up against the Philistines and they ended their oppression in 1071 BC, the Philistines continued to wage war on them until the latter years of King David's reign. With a fractured Egypt rebuilding under foreign pharaohs, the Philistines were virtually acting as independent people, neither subject to or ally with Egyptian rule. Repeatedly defeated by David, the Philistines certainly did not pay taxes to the Egyptians during this time, because the Bible tells us they were forced to pay taxes to the throne of Israel. Okay, so here's where the Bible and the Egyptian history start to come together. For Egypt to rebuild and gain strength as a nation, it was important for them to trade. So Egypt's trade with northern nations such as northern Mesopotamia, Tyre and Sidon meant their traditional trade routes now had to pass through the kingdom of Israel and the coastal plains of Philistia. So up until this, the kingdom fell apart, here's the way to Shur that we talk about that goes through the high country of Israel. It goes up to Shechem, and then it comes down up to Beit Shean and crosses over to the Jordan River, and then they go up into northern Mesopotamia. Here's the coastal road, and of course this was called the way of the land of the Philistines in one direction, or the Egyptians called it the way of Horus. So they had to pass through Philistia. So the Egyptians used to control the coastal route. So this was controlled by Israel, but the coastal route was still controlled by the Egyptians. So I'll just pop this back on the map, the other map. So here's the way to Shur coming up here, through all the biblical names that we recognise, comes up to Beit Shean, and they cross over, and then they would head up the King's Highway, going up to northern Mesopotamia. That's the trade routes. Here's the coastal road. They would go all the way through all the Philistine cities, all the way to Joppa or Jaffa, and then they would cut across from the plain of Sharon, and then they would go through the Jezreel Valley, across the Beit Shean, and hence I've showed a video of this where Beit Shean has the Egyptian governor's house on top. And so when you go to Jaffa today, there's an Egyptian gate where they control Jaffa, so it's all there to be seen. So we know the Egyptians control these trade routes through here. They weren't interested in the country. They're happy to get their taxes, but basically wanted to control the ability to trade. Okay? Whereas this was the other road which the Israelites would have it through here. And so we find that in this particular moment in time, if the Israelites defeat the Philistines, where do the Egyptians go? They can't come up through here unless they pay taxes to the Israelite king. And they can't come up here because they were either paying to the Philistines, but the Philistines are now paying taxes to the Israelites, and hence they would have to pay taxes to the Israelites as well. And so we find that the wealth of King David and the wealth of King Solomon has been talked about, this huge volume of gold and silver. A lot of it's because they're controlling the trade routes up and down around the Mediterranean. And so we find this connection here. Now, okay, so for Egypt to rebuild and gain strength as a nation, it's important for them to trade with northern Mesopotamia, as I've just explained, Tyre and Sidon. So Tyre and Sidon, of course, are up here. There's Tyre, and Sidon's a little bit further, and they were part of Phoenicia in those days in history. Right, so this northern, so they would have to continue all the way up the coast up to there. So all of their trade partners were all affected by this situation. Under the reign of King David, Israel had become the most powerful nation in the region, and when his son Solomon was anointed king in 970 BC, the Bible tells us in 1 Kings chapter 4 verse 21, he ruled over all the kingdoms from the river Euphrates to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. Okay, now the border of Egypt. So here's all this biblical scripture. This is where maps help us tremendously. So I'm flipping back and forth. The border of Egypt is not here as it is today. The border of Egypt in those days is here at this place called Pelusium. Okay, so that means that during the time of King David, they didn't just rule here, they were actually controlling all of this region as well. The Bible tells us so. Okay, and so we see for the Egyptians to come out of their area straight away, they're under the authority of the Israelites. And so when we see the wealth of King David and the wealth of King Solomon, it's connected to this change in history. So if Egypt was to prosper, it either needed to take back control of its old trade routes through the land of Canaan, which is now of course the kingdom of Israel, or it would be necessary for the Pharaoh of Egypt to make a strategic alliance to trade with its new neighbour and the other nations to its north. Under the current circumstances, it made sense for Egypt to seek stability rather than conflict in the region. Why? Because they were weak. They were economically weak, they were politically weak. Now God promised to grant peace to Israel during the time of Solomon, the Bible tells us. And this was not just going to be achieved by staying the sword of his enemies, but by forming strategic alliances. In 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1 it says, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. And so we've come to this time of King Solomon, and all that history that I've just been travelling through paints the picture of what's going on in the region and why stability was important in an alliance with the Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So the question is, we've already mentioned a Pharaoh, the first Libyan Pharaoh, and so who was the Pharaoh who was to become the father-in-law of Solomon? It's actually in your Bible. Does anyone know the name of the Pharaoh? And I'm going to talk about this. He's the first Pharaoh in the Bible who is mentioned by name. And I'm going to say why that is as well. So we start to pick all the pieces together from this part of the Bible. So due to the incomplete Egyptian king lists, so part of the problem that we have historically is that in Egypt, I know it's a bit historical tonight, but it's important. In Egypt, they had a habit of destroying records of previous pharaohs. Now, all of the dating around the world today, for all your museums and all the history that you go to, is all based on Egyptian dating. It's the first dating system that's recognised. The problem is that Egyptian dating is full of faults. You ever realise that they keep finding new pharaohs as the decades go by? They insert the new pharaohs into the timeline, but they never change the timeline. It's a problem. But if they change that timeline, they have to change all the historical dating for all the nations around the world. I think they put it in a too hard basket. So the fact is this is a very real thing. So king lists were actually chiselled into the temples, and these are in the form of cartouches. And they were chiselled in the temples at Karnak, Abydos and Saqqara. And so you can't actually use them. People use these for dating in museums. The problem is two of the king lists are father and son. And the king list for the father and the king list of the son don't even agree with each other. And so it makes a mockery of what actually happened. They actually change and manipulate prior history all the time. Just like when they had the female pharaohs, they defaced all the statues so no one would know they were females. And so I've used a thing that's called the Turin King List. And the Turin King List is in Turin in Italy today. And there was a document that was found that listed every single pharaoh in all the dynasties in Egyptian history in chronological order. It's the only document that does that. And I placed faith in this document and paired the Bible with it, biblical history with it. And it actually completely dovetails all the way through to now where we've got this known documentation. It's quite amazing. The thing is that because it records them in chronological order, it allows us to follow the Bible in chronological order and see who the pharaohs were that were ruling at the same time as the different people in the Bible. So when they name Pharaoh, Pharaoh, Pharaoh all the way through the ancient part of the Bible, they don't put a pharaoh's name, but by using this king list we can actually attribute their names, which I've done. So it goes all the way back to the time of Abraham, and it covers the time, of course, with the Israelite Exodus. So all of the engagements with Egypt in the Bible, we can ascertain who the actual pharaohs are. So following the genealogy of Jesus as we're doing meant that we have to part from Egyptian chronology at this time because we were focusing on the plight of the Israelites once they left Egypt, so we haven't talked about it for some time. But now that we get to the time of King Solomon and he's going to marry the Pharaoh's daughter, we sort of got to reacquaint ourselves with Egyptian chronology to know who these people are and what's going on. So when the first book of Kings says in 1 Kings 3:1, Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter, we're again introduced to a Pharaoh with no identity. It doesn't actually say a Pharaoh's name. But before we return to the Egyptian chronology, it's necessary to know when Solomon reigned over Israel so we can align the two dating systems together. Now there's a biblical chronologist, I don't know if anyone studied this, for this period of Israelite history, and his name's called Edwin Thiel. And he has a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. And he was the one who cracked the code of dating the Bible with all of the kings. And the reason that he cracked it was because they realised that the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah ran on different dating systems. There's actually 6 months apart, and the reason is because some of the dating systems start in spring and some of them start in autumn. And these came about because the people that they were affiliated with or they were controlled by, the different empires, they actually affected the way that dating was done. So he had to work all of this out, and he did so. So it's actually benefited everybody since then. So ironically, the date for Solomon's reign was determined from a single event when his future descendant, King Josiah, whom we'll come to, met his end at the hands of a Egyptian pharaoh. And that pharaoh's name was Necho. Necho. So we can read about how this happened in the second book of Kings, but it's the Egyptian record that accurately and independently dates this event to the summer of 609 BC. So from that fixed event, because they record it in their history as well. So because Egyptian history and biblical history align exactly at that point, you can take that date and go forwards through the kings and backwards through the kings and date all the kings, because the Bible tells us that each king lived for such and such, they were born in this age, they ruled for so long, and they died at a certain age. And so they're able to actually date all of the kings of the Bible from this. And so this is how that happens. So from this fixed date, Edwin Thiel was able to date all of the Israelite kings because both of the Book of Kings, as I said, stipulate this information. So the unknown identity of the Pharaoh king of Egypt, which I've just mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1, later changes in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 40. And if you go to that, you'll find what he's called in the Bible. Anyone got that? 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 40. He actually becomes named Shishak. And if you go to 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 25, it then says Shishak king of Egypt. So we go from Pharaoh king of Egypt to Shishak the king to Shishak king of Egypt. So this is the king who was ruling during the time of Solomon. Okay? So he's usually deemed to be the Pharaoh Shishonk, as they call it, from the different languages. And Egyptians have dated his reign, Egyptologists have dated his reign from 943 to 922 BC. So when we date this, we find that this coincides with the reign of King Solomon. Okay? So historical dating at this point aligns with biblical naming, so we can know who this king is. So Solomon married the daughter of the 22nd dynasty Shishak, king of Egypt, before he began building the temple, the Bible says, 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 2, and in his 4th year of reign in 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1. So the Bible is a bit like a detective story at the moment. You can take all these pieces and put them together and you can establish exactly what was going on. So we can establish from this that the date of marriage was actually between 970 and 967 BC, because the Bible tells us how many years of reign it had actually been. So which does not correlate to the dates that were given for this Pharaoh Shishonk the first. And so this is where we have some battles, and it turns out that there was actually 6 Shishonks. So each father, son, father, son, father, son was named the same. And so in history, what we need to do is go to the Shishonk that was there that coincided with the same date as King Solomon, and we find out which one he actually was. And so we establish that it's actually the second of them, Pharaoh Shishonk, because he ruled Egypt between 979 and 960 BC, and King Solomon came and ruled during the same overlapping period of time. Okay, so the first name of the first Pharaoh in the Bible is actually a Libyan Pharaoh, and so the thing there is that if you ask the question, why aren't the pharaohs named in the Bible before Shishak? The answer is because the
because they before Shishak they all believed they were gods.
Right.
So right. The Lord wouldn't name people who believed they were gods.
Right. There's only one God named in the Bible who's not named in the words of God or Adonai, etc. And it's actually Jesus. Okay. So God will not call a false God in the Bible. There is gods named in the Bible, false gods. However, this is different because the Pharaoh is a living human being, whereas all the other gods were inanimate objects made about in aspects of God's creation. So that God would not name the pharaohs and call them gods in the Bible because they were living. When we get to Shishak, he's named. There was always a curiosity in mine for many years, why is he named and not the ones before him? And the reason is he's the first Libyan pharaoh that's interactive in the Bible, who's known not to be a god because the Egyptian people no longer believe that their pharaohs are gods because they were defeated. Really fascinating, isn't it? So this is the Shishak of the Holy Bible. Now Pharaoh Shishak was neither honoured, worshipped nor deified as a god, because as a pharaoh, the Egyptian people were convinced if their own pharaohs could be beaten, the name of the pharaohs could not be God. So let me just put up a picture. So this is a block statue, as they call. So there's historical evidence, this guy really existed. So this is a block statue of this particular pharaoh. I've just put up in here these different scriptures. The unknown identity of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, turns into Shishak the king, who becomes Shishak, king of Egypt, as the Bible progresses in the same historical period. Solomon married the daughter of Shishak before he began building the temple in 1 Kings 3:2, in the 4th year of his reign in 1 Kings 6:1. So Shishak is the first pharaoh named because, as a Libyan, he was foreign and seen only as a man of the flesh when he ruled over Egypt. And so that's the summation of this period of time. Interestingly, I haven't looked, but we could actually find out the name of Solomon's wife through this historical recording if we so chose to. Okay, because we know the name of the pharaoh and we know which one he was. So Shishonk II, so we're just going to draw to a close. Shishonk II, the fourth pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty, succeeded the throne of Egypt in 979 BC. Contemporary with Solomon, his reign was subject to social unrest, political upheaval, and a divided country that had lost control of trade routes, and previously conquered vassal kingdoms, including those from the former land of Canaan. Egypt's control over the Philistines and many other Canaanite kingdoms had ceased to exist, and the taxes they had once received now went to the newly established kingdom of Israel. How extraordinary it was when Solomon, the newly anointed king of Israel, sent an envoy asking for the hand of his daughter in marriage. Pharaoh Shishonk II understood the strategic nature of this alliance, for it was not only Solomon who sought stability in the region. He agreed to let his daughter marry Solomon, and she moved to the city of David in Jerusalem, where he lived. And so this is before Solomon's built his new palace and the temple was built. So this is all happening before the temple of Jerusalem was built. And so we come to this point where we're going to close. This week we've had a look at all of the tidying up, basically, that Solomon had to do. All of the people that came against his father or himself, they've all been executed, and we find that a situation where the Philistines were, a threat to them was overcome once and for all, and we also find that the Egyptians, who had a lot to do in the land of Israel, no longer had any control. They didn't even have control of their trade routes. They were split into two, and they were weakened and now ruled by a Libyan pharaoh. And so we find that they're seeking an alliance in order to keep the doors open to the trade routes. And so, as you watch by many historical movies, it was very normal to marry your daughter as a political alliance, to seal a relationship with a king of another country. And so King Solomon was told by the Lord that he would live during a time of peace, and the Egyptian pharaoh would normally have been a threat, but at this particular point in time they were weak, and he sought an alliance as well. And hence we find that the Bible dovetails with history, or as I like to say, history supports the truth of the Bible. So we'll draw to a close at this point in time. So thank you for joining us tonight. As I said, it's been a somewhat historical lesson, but we can see that many of the stories in the Bible, they're telling the story from the point of view of God's plan for his people and what happens to his people. But we find that amongst and surrounding all that is the reality of the world, and of course Egypt is their neighbour. And we find that all of those things that are mentioned about marriage, about Solomon's wealth, etc., it actually completely connects with the history of the time. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and we look forward to your company next week as we continue on with Solomon's journey. So God bless you and stay safe.